Okay, I think we'll start. I'm sure we'll have a few more people joining us. So welcome everyone to the final Wiedenbaum Center Public Policy virtual lunch, I guess I have to call it. The end of a very challenging academic year, but I think a successful one. We may have a few new people here, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Steve Fazzari, director of the center. And as it is the end of the academic year, we are just 16 days, if my calculations are correct, away from the time that the university will see if we met our annual goal for Elliott Society membership. So before we start our program, Jim Shealy, the chair of our Elliott Society and very strong and loyal longtime Wiedenbaum Center supporter, will just share a minute or so of thoughts with you. Jim, if you're there, he's on the landline. He'll be just reaching us by audio. So Jim should be unmuted.
Hey, good morning out there. I'm Jim, and I have headed membership on and off for the past 25 years after Murray asked me to join the old Center for the Study of American Business. We are pleased to have asked Molly Klein and Stephen Knight to become vice chairs of the Elliott Society committee. So that helps loot up our executive membership here. And just want to remind you that the center membership has grown well over 6 times in the past 25 years. We rely heavily on members' annual support in order to fund the research and great speakers series that Steve Fazzari puts together for the center. Now today on the panel, in addition to Steve Fazzari and Guillermo, we heartily welcome Steve Smith back here to at the university to participate in the panel. Now, in asking for your help today, any prospective names that you happen to have, I'm going to ask you to send to Mary Myers' email. Now, Mary has been our wonderful university leader, Washington University leader, from the giving office for the past year. Please, if you can, make a note of Mary's email address. It is Mary, M-A-R-Y, Mar, which is spelled M-A-H-E-R, at worcester.edu, which is WUSTL.edu. And listen, thank all of you for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you aboard. Can't thank you enough for the participation, and we shall be in touch with you over the course of the summer. Thank you, Steve Fazzari.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks to Mary for organizing our advancement activities here. She's really been terrific over the years. In fact, I can mention quickly, we have a lot of staff transition. Alana is here with us, and she can wave. Elizabeth Larson, many of you have met Elizabeth, is the new associate director for research and administration, and Veronica is with us today too, also for her first Wiedenbaum Center event. So Veronica's handling a lot of our accounting and HR and grant administration work going forward. So it's great to have our new staff members. Things are clicking along pretty well there with a lot of transitions we're dealing with. Melinda Warren, as you know, is retiring. She's actually off today, kind of putting some much deserved vacation time on before she ends up at the end of June. And we've really been grateful for everything Melinda's done for the center over 40 years. It's really quite amazing. So we should move on with the program. Let me just thank all of you for your help and your support. It's been an interesting year, to say the least. We've had more than 20 events, though, remotely. A lot of people have joined us, not just from the St. Louis region, but around the country, which is great. And we'll be continuing our remote events in the early part of the fall. We hope to move in person at some point, not too far into the next academic year, but we're going to keep a remote component as much as we can going forward, because it's been quite successful, I think, in linking folks together. So today, what we're going to do is assess the early months of the Biden administration. You know, this idea of the first 100 days is a kind of typical meme when a new president comes into office. We're a little past the first 100 days, but it's still a good time to sit back and think about how things have gone and what the questions are, concerns are going forward with the Biden administration. So we're going to just jump right into it. I want to reintroduce Steve Smith, who Jim mentioned briefly. Steve is the Kate M. Gregg Distinguished Professor of Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science here at Washington University. Steve's an expert on American politics, special focus on the US Congress. Steve did direct the Wiedenbaum Center for nearly 20 years. And as a result of that, for other reasons, I'm really grateful to Steve, but in particular, I appreciate his suggestion for the idea for today's program. So thanks for that, Steve. And tell us what you think about how Joe Biden's doing in his first 100+ days.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thanks to everyone. This is maybe one more chance for me to thank you all for nearly 20 years of support for the center, and I'm looking forward to working closely with the center and seeing you in person at future events. And a special thank you to the new staff members who joined the center. I left just in time for Steve to have to make new appointments. And he's done a fantastic job. So it's just great to see you here too. Well, this has been an amazing ride since, should I say January 20th or should I say January 6th? We've had an amazing few months, and it looks like the Trump years are lingering. And one of the issues we might want to address, maybe more in question and answer, is exactly where is the Republican Party going, which is more than merely a sideshow to what's going on in the Biden administration. I think it's more than a sideshow in large part because congressional Republicans are a little bit anxious about where their party is heading. It's obvious that some of them want to humor Donald Trump and others want to jettison him from the party, and most are just simply keeping quiet on the question. But Trump's ability to rally key elements of the Republican Party is something that Republicans recognize and is creating a bit of a challenge for them. Let me just divide my comments about Biden into several parts: a legislative part and a regulation and administrative part, and then talk a little bit about the next election. And then I'll pause and be happy to answer questions later. Let me just first point out here the challenges of the Biden legislative record so far. I've listed about, I don't know, a dozen or so bills here that have been supported by President Biden. And I've indicated how many have been enacted in the first check column. And you can see only 2 of the many have passed. Obviously, the COVID relief bill passed very quickly. And then when hate crimes against Asian Americans became an issue, both the House and the Senate, with plenty of support from both parties, quickly passed the hate crime bill to include Asians among those covered by previous hate crimes statutes. In the next column, you can see that the House has been very busy, but that most of the legislation endorsed by Biden and pushed by the Democrats in Congress has stalled in the Senate. So the House acted very quickly on including gender identity under various civil rights laws. The For the People Act is HR 1. It's the big election and voting reform bill that the Democrats are pushing. Gun background checks, violence against women, the DREAM Act. I should have put a check mark in there against violence against women on the House, in the House column. farm worker, immigration legislation, the DC statehood bill, the January 6th commission, the idea of establishing a blue ribbon commission to investigate the events surrounding the January 6th events on Capitol Hill, passed the House quickly, but it was killed on a filibuster, thus the red X in the Senate. The equal pay bill similarly has been blocked so far by a filibuster in the Senate. The technology bill is one of the rare bills that's passed the Senate first. This is the bill that passed last week and represents a bipartisan effort to do something about the challenges the US faces from China in the area of technology. The bill passed with 68 votes. It was 49 Democrats and 19 Republicans. One Democrat did not vote for it, and that was Bernie Sanders. But all the Republican leadership, including Senator Blunt, including Senator McConnell, including Senator Cornyn, voted in favor of the bill with the Democrats. A majority of the Republicans voted against it, probably not so much because they were really against it, but because it was going to cost $250 billion without a clear way of paying for it. The bill now goes to the House. But it's an amazing bill and little noticed in the media because of attention to so many other issues. But this was one of the largest, we would call it industrial policy initiatives ever taken up in the United States. It directly funds technological and scientific development in advanced electronic technologies, directly funds the production of chips for computers. And of course, many of you know that they're in desperate short supply right now as we're coming out of the pandemic. And invests in federal research, federally funded research in technology in a huge way, including, among other things, creating a big new technology directorate in the National Science Foundation. This will be a big boost to scientific funding for universities where much of this research, of course, is conducted. And then in blue, you can see are the outstanding bills, the big infrastructure bill that's currently under negotiation. 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats in the Senate say they have an agreement on a version of it. It's not clear where the Biden White House will go on that yet. We'll hear more about that later this week, I think. And the big family plan, our social welfare reform bill, is just sitting there. It's taking a backseat to infrastructure. Now, in the case of those 2 bills, I put a check mark in the far right. The Democratic versions of those bills probably would not pass the Senate, maybe because there wouldn't even be a majority for them, but certainly because the Republicans could kill them by filibuster. So the Democrats are looking for a way to circumvent the filibuster, and one way to do that is to consider them as budget measures under the reconciliation procedure. Many of you realize that such bills cannot be filibustered. There's still great uncertainty about how the Democrats will proceed on that. If there is a bipartisan agreement, it's not clear whether the Democrats would take what remains in the Biden plan and pass it as a separate reconciliation bill. Republicans might want to say, you have to promise us not to do that if we're going to agree to a first version. And then, of course, we can't forget that October 1 is the beginning of the fiscal years, and all spending bills have to be passed by then, or there's a government shutdown. The House has only passed just in the last day a bill that initiates the appropriations process. And so the appropriation bills will be coming to the floor in July, in August, and September. And of course, there are big partisan differences over that issue. let me move quickly to a word or two about the regulatory moves that the administration has made. The most obvious thing happened on day one when Biden revoked President Trump's signature regulatory policy orders. One being the executive order that put in place the 2-for-1. That is, you have to get rid of 2 rules in order to put a new one in place. And the cost-based regulatory budget, that is to set a maximum on how much regulations can cost in any given year. Trump put those in place in his first year, and they're now gone. The second big thing that we'd want to pay attention to is the way in which the Biden White House intends to use OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, that reviews all proposed rules and regulations with an eye to imposing the president's own view of regulation. The first thing that Biden did was to reestablish the OIRA process that was in place before Trump came into office, which included a very broad definition of benefits, making it easier in a cost-benefit comparison for benefits to win out, and therefore easier to accept the regulation. But an interesting development, the importance of which we really haven't, we really cannot know now because the OIRA is undergoing a process of giving this further definition, is that the president demanded that OIRA take into account not only the balance of costs and benefits, but the distribution of cost and benefits. So that if there's exceptionally high impact of costs or benefits, so real big winners or real big losers, that ought to be taken into account in the balance in evaluating rules and regulations. That's potentially very important, but it really depends on the details, and OIRA has yet to issue any further statements about how that's going to be done. And in general, OIRA is under a direct direction from the president to be proactive in prompting regulatory activity, not just accepting rules and regulations for review that come from departments and agencies, but going out to those departments and agencies and saying, this is an area that must be addressed. Please generate some new regulations. So presumably that'll reflect the priorities, things like climate change, racial equality, and so on, that are high on the agenda of the administration. Let me just say a word about the next election. As most of you know, we'll have a midterm election. We've got a Democratic president, so it's generally assumed that the Democrats in Congress will suffer the greatest losses. In the House right now, we have an exceptionally close House of Representatives because of 5 vacancies, 2 because of deaths, 2 because the House members went into the Biden administration, and 1 strange case because the legislator wanted to become the president of the Ohio Chamber of Commerce. One of the stranger midterm resignations that I've seen lately. So the current breakdown is 219 Democrats and 211 Republicans. So with only 430 seats filled, a majority in the House right now is 216. So the Democrats can lose only 3 votes on any matter and risk, or otherwise risk losing their House majority. So things are very tight in the House. What's happened in recent years, though, is that the president's party tends not to lose as many seats as was true a few decades ago. Most of us here remember swings of 30 or 40 or 50 seats in the House of Representatives, but that isn't happening so much anymore. The main reason seems to be that most congressional districts, House districts, are kind of locked in for one party or the other. And there's enough room to maneuver for each dominant party that they can afford to lose a few votes and still retain the seat. So even if the national vote swings a little bit in the favor of the Republicans, we wouldn't expect a huge shift in the membership. But given how close the margin is, only a few seats could determine which party is in the majority. And I would give, at the moment, the Democrats a slight edge in retaining in the majority. But that's really all I can say. I would not bet the house on it. I'm showing the graph here for the Senate. And the Senate's interesting because of the 34 seats that are up for re-election in 2022, 20 are currently held by the Republicans. So the Republicans in principle are a lot more vulnerable to losing seats this year than are the Democrats. What makes the Republican position even more precarious is the fact that all 5 of the senators who've announced their retirement from the Senate, including Missouri's Roy Blunt, all 5 are Republicans. So Republicans are giving up some seats where the incumbent might be expected to hold it. This is especially true in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. I really don't expect Portman's seat in Ohio or Blunt's seat in Missouri or Shelby's seat in Alabama to go Democratic. But Toomey in Pennsylvania and Burr in North Carolina are representing states that where the margin between the parties is ever so close. And so those are 2 seats that the Democrats are targeting, and there'll be a truckload of money spent there because of that. On the Democratic side, only 14 seats are up. So they're in a little bit better position. They're not particularly vulnerable, except maybe Warnock in Georgia. You know, Warnock won the special election, of course, earlier this year, and he has to stand for regular election in 2022. And given the margins there, just a few voters changing preferences or turning out could make the difference. We might think that Kelly in Arizona or Hassan in New Hampshire, both states that are very competitive, would also be possible problems for the Democrats. But Warnock in Georgia is the big one. But you can see the result is that it's ever so close in the Senate. We just can't find enough seats to clearly predict that one party or the other is going to maintain or gain a majority in what is now the 50-50 Senate. I think I'll just quit there, Steve, and wait for questions later.
Okay, yeah, let's do a couple of questions now. We have a lot to do today, so maybe we'll have time at the end for more general questions, but a few have come in and I wanted to share them. One that I think is on a lot of our minds, this comes from Elizabeth Larson, is Joe Manchin. Is Joe Manchin holding the administration hostage? And to what extent, if he is there anything Biden can really do about it?
Well, Joe Manchin, of course, requires that we get into his psychology and or invent some political strategy. I think the truth of the matter is that Manchin is a Democrat in a very Republican state, West Virginia, and he has to play a very difficult game. He wants to be a team player among Democrats in the Senate, but he also wants to show a large, wide independent streak in order to get reelected. So he wants that independence to be so visible that it can't be ignored by middle of the road voters. So that's more or less his game. Now, exactly where his breaking point is, I'm not sure. We can think about this in terms of 2 issues. One is the substance of public policy. He's clearly looking for a way to be more conservative than most Democrats. And so on the issue of infrastructure, he's already struck out and said that the president's infrastructure bill is too large, deals with too many things that are not strictly infrastructure, and he would oppose it. And therefore, he's among the 5 Democrats who are working with the Republicans on something that's about half the size of what Biden proposed. On the more general question of the Senate filibuster, the Senate Democrats cannot reform the filibuster without him. And he says, along with Sinema of Arizona, that he will not budge and he will not allow the filibuster to be reformed. Democrats are looking for a way to get him to budge on that, but they haven't found it yet. And whether he'll budge in the long run, I'm not sure. I'm guessing not. But Democrats are working hard on it, I can assure you, and For one thing, Manchin always argues that small state interests are protected by the Senate filibuster, and Democrats are countering that by showing that the Senate itself is hurt by the filibuster. If the Senate can't act, the Senate as an institution is weakened, and small states' real interests are in protecting the Senate because large states are represented proportionately in the House. Small states have a big advantage in the Senate. So the argument of some Democrats to Manchin is, look, you've got to protect the Senate, not just one particular rule of the Senate. Still, I don't think that argument's going to fly with him, and I think that a result is that the Democrats' agenda is going to be very small for the rest of the year.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There are actually some interesting comments in the chat about Joe Manchin and stuff. We could probably talk about it for the whole session. But before we move on, I do want to ask one other different question, which I think is really interesting. It came in from JB Spencer before we even started, and the question is this: Are there specific skills, personal governing skills that Joe Biden really got as vice president that is affecting his performance right now and his effectiveness as president? And would this actually carry forward to Kamala Harris in some respects? I know that's kind of a broad question, but do you have any thoughts about that interesting idea?
Well, Biden, of course, was an unusually well-prepared vice president. And so he's an unusually well-prepared president. And when it comes to evaluating the role of the vice president, you always have to, the number one consideration is what are the needs of the incumbent president. And each incumbent president has varying needs. So as vice president, Biden came in with a lifetime of service in the Senate. Remember, when he became vice president in 2009, he had been a US Senator since 1973. So, and including all that time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and many years as its chair or as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was an exceptionally well-prepared public servant in that range of foreign and domestic affairs. So when he enters the Obama administration, with Obama having just served a few years in the Senate and being much younger, Biden was of tremendous assistance to him. He brought, of course, considerable knowledge of international affairs to the White House and spent a lot of time on the road representing the administration. I think during the Obama years, he made about 10 trips to Iraq alone to represent the president there. Just an exceptionally well-qualified guy on that. When they passed the 2009 stimulus bill to deal with the Great Recession, Biden was put in charge of the multi-agency effort to coordinate that spending. And of course, it produced all that money for the two auto companies. It did so many other things with no major funding scandals. And he was in charge of that. So he was an ever-present vice president. And of course, finally, he was the president's problem solver when it came to the United States Senate. That was 12 years ago. So there were still many senators in the Senate at that time who had served for many years with Biden and who he knew extremely well. And so I remember the START Treaty, the 2010 tax package, the 2011 debt ceiling stalemate that was so threatening to our economy. All those things, Biden stepped in and helped resolve on behalf of Obama. So now Biden is president with all that experience behind him. He doesn't have nearly the needs that Obama did when he first came into office. And so Harris is in a very different situation. She has Obama's kind of level of experience, but in the Senate, but she has ever so much more state level experience, having been attorney general, having been a prosecutor for many years. She has a different kind of experience. Harris, like Biden, seems to always be in the room with the president when important decisions are made. And like Biden, she's being assigned major tasks. She's been very publicly put in charge of championing the issue of voting rights for the Biden administration. As we saw last week when she was in Central America, She's been asked to take the lead in deterring migration from the Northern Triangle countries. She's been put in charge of the policing overhaul legislation going through Congress. And generally, of course, is representing the administration on the question of race relations. So she's just simply has a different role because she's serving a president who's got a different background. The other thing about Biden is that he likes to operate through, I'll call them mini czars, who coordinate issue areas that are important to the president. So John Kerry is in charge of climate change, and Gene Sperling was in charge of COVID relief, and so on. Many of these efforts on the part of the administration are multi-policy, multi-agency efforts, and Biden likes these kind of mini czars in a way that Obama never did. So Harris's role is to take on the role of a mini czar in any of 2 or 3 or 4 different areas, and I'm sure she'll pick up more.
Thanks, Steve. That's really interesting, and a lot of insight into what the history was for Joe Biden and where he's come from, and how that might affect Kamala Harris going forward. There's lots of interesting questions here. I'd like to continue, but I'm watching this clock tick away in my moderator role. So I'm going to shift over to our Associate Director of the Wiedenbaum Center, Professor Guillermo Rosas, who's also Professor of Political Science and an expert on comparative politics with a special focus on Latin America. So we wanted to have at least some part of this assessment of the early Biden administration. It's going to be focused obviously on the US, but how the US is relating to the rest of the world. So Guillermo, I know you're planning to talk about some of the immigration issues, and there was actually a few questions we got along these lines, especially how it affects the southern border. Are you out there?
I am here and
Great.
ready to go. Thank you very much, Steve. I hope that you can see my slides there. And thank you all for being here today. It's a pleasure to join you. Yeah, as Steve was mentioning, my remit is kind of broad. Originally it was talking about foreign affairs and international relations with the United States. That's, of course, a gigantic purview. So we decided I would say a fast few things about migration. And the place to start, of course, is just to remind you, as if this was necessary, that migration policy was one of the areas that I would venture to say was one of the areas in which Trump was relatively successful in changing in a short period of time sort of the broad contours of migration policy in the United States. Now, there are a couple of things to remember. Most of the changes that he did manage to produce were the product of extensive use of executive powers rather than congressional action. And so this means that these are changes that in principle should also be relatively easy to reverse. The issue is that there was so much of this, so many directives, actions that came directly from the executive office, that a full rollback, as Biden had anticipated, of Trump's very restrictive migration agenda will probably take a while. So as you can see in these lists that I very quickly put together, it was not only that Trump increased enforcement against undocumented immigrants in the country, deepening and making more aggressive the policies that the Obama administration had already been pursuing in removing undocumented aliens from the country. It was also that some of Trump's actions affected legal pathways of migration into the country. So I thought that a relatively efficient way of looking at some of the changes that the Biden administration has put together or has produced in the past 3 months or so is to just provide you with a quick list here. So some of the issues that were relatively easy to solve, you see at the top of the table. So from day one of the Biden administration, the administration terminated the emergency declaration in the southern border that Trump had passed in 2019. If you recall, that basically had given Trump the ability to move monies that had been approved by the federal government to be spent in the construction of the border wall. And it also allowed Trump the possibility of using armed forces to move them to the border and to carry out some operations there. So that was terminated right away. The same thing happened with so-called asylum cooperation agreements that the Trump administration had carried out with the countries in the Northern Triangle. Of these, honestly, the only one that had been working was the Guatemalan agreement that basically allowed the United States the possibility of sending to Guatemala people that came from that country that were asking for asylum so that they would wait for the decision there. And even this agreement was not fully operative once the COVID pandemic started. In any case, these have been rescinded. Now, an important part of the Trump policy to deal with the flow, especially of asylum seekers into the United States, are the so-called migration protection protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. So this was a policy that started in 2018. In 2019, the Trump administration strong-armed the administration of President López Obrador in Mexico to force Mexico to collaborate more extensively with the Remain in Mexico policy. And as a consequence of this, what Mexico ended up providing was the possibility to receive migrants that were coming to the United States, showed up at the port of entry in the United States, declared that they were asking for asylum, and they would be placed under the protection of the Mexican government, which in principle needed to provide documentation for these immigrants, needed to provide some services in education, healthcare, even some sort of ability to obtain gainful employment while they waited for their opportunity to prove or to move forward their asylum case in the United States. So here you see that one thing that the Biden administration has done is that it has stopped new enrollments into the migrant protection protocols. And more recently, in an effort to try to start solving the backlog of cases of people that are on the Mexican side of the border with an appointment to try to move forward their asylum claim, they have started to move some of these asylum seekers into the United States to wait for their hearing in the United States, and even allowing some of these migrants to enter the country and distribute them, distribute themselves around the country. So that's an important change that the Biden administration has produced. Another important Trump policy, this started also in 2018, was the so-called metering of asylum seekers. Under this particular policy, asylum seekers arriving at ports of entry could receive the news that those ports of entry were full. Again, they needed to go to a different port of entry to register their determination to seek asylum. And after that, more likely than not, they would be sent to Mexico. But not only that, under these metering orders, the United States services were only allowed to invite a relatively small number of cases per day to come and pledge for asylum. So these orders have not been rescinded. In fact, they remain in place. But as I said before, what seems to be happening is that the Biden administration, somewhat haphazardly, has been finding carve-outs and moving people to try to solve that particular backlog. I mentioned there as well the issue of refugee caps, which the Trump administration had imposed early on. You can see here the blue timeline that corresponds to the annual ceiling on the number of individuals that the United States can accept as refugees. And you can definitely see that precipitous decline during the Trump administration that has just been reversed under Biden. Now you do see the orange timeline that suggests that even though the caps have been increased under COVID, of course, the number of admitted refugees has remained low. I'm keeping an eye on time here, and I also see the time running out of time. So let me just very quickly mention Title 42, the Title 42 program. So if you recall, once COVID started, the Trump administration took advantage of a decision by the CDC that basically advised the government to secure the border and prevent the entry of individuals that came from countries where the pandemic was not under control. And so this, for all practical purposes, meant that even those arriving seeking for asylum would not be registered, sent to Mexico, and have to wait there for their opportunity to pledge their case. In fact, what this basically meant is that no one was received at the border. The border was closed for practical purposes. Now, this is important because, first of all, Title 42 remains in place. And this has two immediate consequences. The first consequence is that since the border is closed for these kind of cases, multiple attempts to re-enter the country do not trigger illegal re-entry prosecution, which means that there is an incentive for migrants to try several times to come into the United States. Furthermore, because Title 42 doesn't apply to kids, there is also an incentive for families that are traveling together to try to send the kids first alone, and then they themselves will try to come into the United States through alternative entryways to try to be reunited with their kids. So as you can imagine, the continuation of Title 42 continues to be a thorn on Biden's side, especially from the left, in the left wing of the Democratic Party. There is a lot of criticism that he has not removed this particular policy. I want to finish by noting that something that should be, I mean, this is pretty noticeable, right? The fact that the flows of migrants arriving at the border have increased recently. It is very difficult to figure out what's cause, what's effect here. It is very obvious if you look at the blue timeline that even, by the first month of the Biden administration, there was already an uptick. This is the line that corresponds to 2021 in the number of new arrivals to the southern border. But one needs to acknowledge two things. First, there is always a seasonal effect in the rhythms of migration in the United States. The orange line here corresponds to the last year before COVID, 2019, and you do see that the spring and summer months are the months where the largest amount of migrants flow into the border. The other interesting thing is that contrary to what happened in 2019, under that surge, we now see that a very large amount of the new migrants arriving in the southern border are actually single adults, as opposed to minors or families that come together. And another interesting aspect is that the rise in the number of migrants that are not from Mexico or the Northern Triangle has really increased disproportionately. So these are people from Brazil, Venezuela, other parts of the world that first come to Mexico and then try to reach the border. I probably should stop there, Steve.
Okay, Guillermo, thank you.
Sorry about that.
Very interesting. A lot of information. Actually, what you just got up there is interesting in the sense that COVID's really changed a lot of things, and it's probably the case that a lot of the dynamics here, we're not going to be able to really sort this out for a while in terms of what is driving what. We've had depressed immigration attempts with COVID, and now there's some catch up. But you mentioned Brazil, for example, which has been heavily affected by the virus, and so there's a lot going on there. We should shift to our final speaker, although he can adjust his own timing. But I did want to ask you before you leave. In general, and I think you've partially answered this question, but Keith Guller sent this interesting question ahead of time about, aside from the general tone, which is clearly different between Biden and Trump, is your sense there is a significant difference in policy? From what you said, I think the answer is probably yes, but I'd like to hear what your perspectives are on that.
So I guess the two obvious contrasts are, first, putting a more humane face on US migration policy, right? A lot of what we have been seeing here in the past 100 days basically pursue that purpose. And the other one is this notion that the only way to solve this problem is eventually to stop migration from happening in the countries of origin. And that's the second big change, right? The idea that you have to stem the flow in its origins. And for that purpose, as you know, Steve just mentioned this a few moments ago, Vice President Harris had her first test in the area of foreign relations traveling to Guatemala and Mexico just a week ago. And I guess part of the purpose was to try to figure out how exactly that can be done. There are important quandaries. First of all, it's not entirely obvious that a lot of foreign aid and a lot of aid for development really stems migration flows. I think the jury is still out on that one. And the second one is that even if we could somehow believe that helps, you need to have as interlocutors governments that are functional, that provide effective governance, And that is a problem in the Northern Triangle, right? Where at least in 2 of the 3 countries, we now see very clear evidence of illiberal regimes taking place that are fairly corrupt. And the third one might not be illiberal, but it's the Honduras government, right? But it's also a government, a weak government with lots of problems and lots of reasons to believe that this might not be the best interlocutors to have, even if the United States manages to collaborate with Mexico and with the countries in the Northern Triangle to stem the flows of migrants that leave El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala.
Certainly a big challenge for the Biden administration.
It's a close challenge, yeah, for
the U.S. has been struggling with immigration policy for decades. Certainly going back at least to the Reagan years and probably beyond that. And it's a really tough problem with in so many different directions, which actually gives me a bit of a transition into economics. So our third speaker is somebody I actually know very well. Actually, I've known him for my entire life because it's me. So I'm happy to introduce myself. Steve Fazzari, professor of economics, professor of sociology, director of the Wiedenbaum Center, and various other hats that I can't remember at the moment. So I'd like just to share with you a few thoughts about the economy in the early days of the Biden administration before we wrap up. So I actually want to start with something that I think is very important, but didn't really quite fit into any of our 3 panelists specifically in terms of our expertise, and that's the performance of the administration, the new administration with the COVID virus. So it has the economic link, the obvious economic link, because every economist that thought seriously about it, and a lot of economists have been thinking seriously about the economic impacts of the pandemic, basically said it's all about the virus the first factor. When the virus will recede, what kinds of second, third, fourth waves we get, and then when we were talking about this a year ago, the progress of vaccinations. Well, so how does that stand in some respects? I think it's pretty widely known. I just saw that, I think the statistics in the New York Times this morning, 65% of American adults over the age of 18 have received a vaccination. Younger people are starting to get vaccinated. The case numbers are falling quite dramatically. I mean, this has to count as a big win for the early Biden administration. It might have happened had Trump won 2020 as well. I think realistically, you have to say that the development of the vaccine was a scientific triumph, and that happened under the Trump administration. So that we are seeing, in the United States at least, the virus moving towards coming under control. One worries that maybe we jumped too fast, too far in terms of some of the precautions we've been taking. And of course, we also have the difficulty that I'm a minority, but a large minority of the population seem to be against getting the virus, or certainly have against getting the vaccination, and have major concerns along those lines. But that said, it seems like overall the economy is bouncing back, from the crisis, from the pandemic crisis, and that's led to some of the strong outcomes in the last few months. Let me be more specific about where things are going and how they relate to the Biden administration. Well, the big news out there right now, especially because of the consumer price index data that came out last week, is inflation. And there's all sorts of concerns about, is inflation taking off? What will the Fed do? Will the Fed have to raise interest rates? And I think one has to take a step back on all of this, which is to recognize the remarkable economic disruption that did take place during the pandemic. And all of us economists looking at this expected this would be kind of a rocky process of restarting. And in particular, what economists would call relative price changes, that some industries are more affected than others. There are supply constraints in some places relative to others. And in general, these relative price effects are going to lead to some inflationary pressure. An example that I've read about is the lumber industry. So when the pandemic hit, there was a thought that home building was going to slow down. People wouldn't be, we'd have a housing crash or something, maybe some reflection back to the previous Great Recession. But in fact, it was exactly the opposite. People became interested in bigger houses, new houses, maybe away from city centers and things along those lines. So demand increased, supply was down, lumber prices go way up. What does that do? Well, that's really a relative price shift as a result of these pandemic disruptions, but it leads to an increase in inflation because lumber is going to be part of the prices, not directly maybe the consumer price index, but certainly would feed into that. If you look at the May data that got lots of attention, car and truck prices were up 30% year over year, a huge increase. Some of that's due to the semiconductor issue that Steve Smith mentioned earlier on, that's slowing down car supplies. Some of it is due, again, probably to people maybe having some extra money in their bank accounts from the stimulus checks and wanting to get a new car or something along those lines. And also this big so-called base effect, that it's up 30% year over year, but that's relative to a very depressed level a year ago. Gas prices that may be even more interesting. They actually declined slightly in May. You may not realize that, but I'll check the CPI numbers, but they're up 50% year over year. Again, that base effect because they had fallen so much before. And in some broad sense, these kinds of shifts are disruptive, they're kind of significant, they can lead to big headlines in the economic news, but I'm going to give maybe a Murray Wiedenbaum kind of response, which is trust the market. These things are going to be temporary. The supply chain issues will get worked out. High prices in some areas will pull resources into those areas. And so I don't think I don't think this is an indication of really long-term inflationary pressure. Now, a bigger issue, and one more closely tied to the Biden administration, is the demand boost from the various relief packages, rescue packages that have been passed. And this question about whether we have too much fiscal stimulus already in the pipeline, and that's going to lead to a bigger inflationary effect. Now, just kind of reviewing where we've been along these lines, I would argue that the effects from what happened in 2020 are largely gone. So a lot of times you'll hear these multi-trillion-dollar numbers. We put $6 trillion, we put $8 trillion into stimulus, but much of that was a year ago. The non-trivial amount passed at the very end of 2020, and then the American Rescue Act now, which I'll come back to. But I'm thinking more than half of it was fairly early in the pandemic, and I think that's played out by this point. Yes, some bank accounts are fatter, but if there was going to be some quick spending out of those bank accounts, that's probably pretty much happened at this point. The American Rescue Act, which was passed, as Steve Smith said, early in the Biden administration, was an aggressive package to try to deal with the economic fallout from the pandemic, extending the unemployment benefits through September, which is maybe the most controversial part of it. Additional stimulus, $600 at the end of the Trump administration, $1,400 per person for a total of $2,000 in January and early February. So it did pump a lot of stimulus into the economy. Now we're a few months down the road from that. I don't think the effects are fully played out. However, it does seem like, again, mostly what we're seeing is the relative price effects. Another example comes to mind. Does it surprise you to think that a big part of the inflationary surge in May was in airline tickets? Again, these kinds of things that are going to be adjusting as the economy reopens and responds to a very dramatic and uneven set of policies. So I think it's a little bit too early to come up with a final judgment on the American Rescue Act in terms of, is it too much stimulus? Will it be inflationary? But I think we're moving in that direction. And so far, I'd say the news is pretty good. You might ask, well, how long is it going to be until we actually know how this is played out? And I would say 6 to 9 months. I think by the fall and into early next year, if we're not seeing some big accelerations in inflation, or if we see some of these disruptive effects, short-term disruptive effects come out, will these inflation numbers calm down? My guess is yes, but I think there's a lot of uncertainty about that. When we look at the infrastructure or the family policy or the R&D industrial policy that Steve Smith talked about earlier, these things are by no means trivial in terms of the overall macroeconomy, but they're not overwhelming either. Again, when you see headline numbers, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, remember that while the COVID responses were right on there, I mean, they passed the American Rescue Act in January and people were getting checks within weeks. These other policies are more long-term policies, 5, 8, 10 years out. And so, $1 trillion over 10 years is 100 billion, which is a lot of money by anybody's measure, but relative to a $21-22 trillion US economy, a pretty small amount. I actually did a very quick back of the envelope calculation and said, if everything that Steve had on his early chart in the Biden administration. Maybe I didn't get everything there, but the big ones: the family leave, the industrial policy, the infrastructure, passed as proposed by the Biden administration. We're talking about, and then was spread out the way it's proposed, we're talking about 2 to 3% of extra economic stimulus over the next 5 to 10 years, 2 to 3% of GDP. That's big, that's not trivial, but it's not overwhelmingly huge in terms of what's going on. If you rewind some of my comments over the years back, we were not having that big of a booming economy in the recovery of the Great Recession. So as the economy goes forward, as we get through the reopening after COVID, actually having a modest stimulus of that size probably would be beneficial in many respects from the macroeconomic point of view. There's obviously lots of questions about what the right policies are there. Let me just finish up with some comments about wage pressure. It's a pretty interesting debate that's evolving. My own thinking is evolving. And most of this centers around the extended unemployment benefits. So we had quite a significant supplement to state level unemployment passed about a year ago in the CARES Act, $600 additional supplement that was really very broadly spread, extended eligibility to gig workers like Uber drivers that were not covered under regular state programs. And then an extension of that program, but finally in the American Rescue Act passed in the Biden administration, $300 supplement extended through September. And this has gotten a lot of attention. The Republicans in particular have criticized it and saying, oh, it's slowing job growth, that by basically paying people not to work, they're less likely to go back and take jobs. As a result, here in Missouri, I believe it's actually kind of today, effectively, that the governor has shut this down, despite the fact that it's money from the federal government with no impact on Missouri taxpayers. In fact, Missouri taxpayers are paying for this in a sense because it's a federal program and through their federal taxes, but the supplement is no longer available to unemployed workers in Missouri. And I've actually been talking to a number of journalists about this over time. And so, how big is this effect? Is this a good policy? Is it not a good policy? So I think the first answer is nobody really knows. It's unusual. We don't have a lot of history to really track this directly. If you look historically at extended unemployment, which had very different structure and very different kinds of economic circumstances, what you saw was a relatively small effect, maybe no effect by many studies, which has led some economists, especially early on, to say this won't have that big of an effect on people taking jobs. I think that's probably a little bit, in a sense, too optimistic about the policy if you look at taking jobs as the objective, in the sense that this is a very unusual policy. It's bigger, it's a different kind of situation. I wouldn't be so surprised. I would actually expect that at least some modest slowdown in the increase of jobs is the result of this extended unemployment. I think the bigger question, though, is that necessarily a bad thing? The economy is recovering very quickly at this point. The April job numbers were somewhat disappointing with, I think it was about 225,000 jobs created, but that was actually a strong number even in normal years. In May, we had 559,000 jobs created. It's a very strong number. I think there was some expectation because of the quick bounce back last summer, where we had a couple of million one month, I think 4 million in another month, that maybe we could have this million plus kinds of months. But looking back on that, I think it was unrealistic. That those initial bounce backs were a lot of temporary layoff, people coming back to work after we adjusted to that very first, very disruptive lockdown in the pandemic. And now it's going to be a little harder. And we have, firms have to decide to hire, workers have to decide they're looking for those jobs. And this matching problem that economists emphasize is not trivial to find the right person for the right job. And so it's going to take a little bit longer. And so I think numbers well into the 300, 400, 500,000 as we go forward is what I expect, is really pretty much what we would expect even without the extended unemployment. The other thing is it has shifted bargaining power, and it's giving some workers the opportunity to think about where they really want to be. And it's requiring some firms, businesses to raise wages, especially at the lower part of the income distribution. You see a lot in the financial press, this idea that the policy is creating a tight labor market. And sometimes that is viewed as a criticism. And I look at it, isn't a tight labor market kind of what we want when jobs are available and workers have some extra bargaining power as time goes on? Sure, it could slow some of the recovery. but I suspect that's only modest. And the other thing, and maybe my last point here, is that it's going to expire in mid-September. We are actually, when I was talking to a reporter about this a few days ago, I was thinking, oh, that's only like 12 weeks away, which scares me because I'm an academic, and that means the summer is over sooner than I want. But the point is that people are reassessing what's going on. They're going to be moving forward in some ways. I think folks are going to recognize that this benefit's going to go away, and are going to have to make some decisions about coming into the labor market if they have relied on it heavily. So I was disappointed that Missouri pulled out of the program. I think it would have been helpful for people that are facing a variety of challenges over the pandemic. I don't think it was a huge effect on the labor market, but it probably has some effect. And so we'll probably see that play out over the next few months, certainly by late summer and early fall. So I look at the time here, it's already 1:02. That's a pretty quick overview. I've got lots more notes, no big surprise there in terms of where the economy is and a bit how some of the big Biden policies have interacted there. I want to thank Steve and Guillermo. I know Guillermo had to run off as Steve is still with us. What I'm going to do is something we've had in the past here. I'm going to formally end our session because we're at the end of our hour of remote Zoom time. I really appreciate the folks who are on. We were up well over 90 for a while. We still have 74 participants there. So thanks for hanging in there. I'm gonna mute my screen, mute my microphone for a few minutes, but I will come back if anybody wants to hang on, maybe for a little bit more discussion for another 10 or 15 minutes. So happy to have your participation, happy to have your support. Remember Mary Maher's email address if you haven't renewed your membership. We would love to have you help us make our goal. We're close, as I understand, as we go forward. But we'll look forward to seeing everybody at late August, early September when we start up the Wiedenbaum Center events again. So have a great summer.